heart won dry land, wet eyes. The sun over the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1881 was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, beating the high desert into submission, cracking the red earth like old pottery and bleaching the bones of last winter's misfortunes to a stark, prayerful white. The wind, its accomplice, was a thief, stealing the moisture from a man's lips before he could wet them and carrying the grit of the canyons into his eyes. His teeth, the very weave of his shirt. For Talas Begay, this land was not an enemy. It was a language he had learned from birth. He knew its whispers and its roars. His eyes, the color of dark, wet stone, could read the subtle shift in a lizard's path, the faint promise of green in a line of distant cottonwoods, the way the heat shimmered differently over a hidden spring. He was a water finder, a gift passed down from his mother's clan. And in this thirsty country, it made him more vital than any warrior with a rifle. His horse, a sturdy paint mare named Skyjumper, picked her way through the maze of arroyos and mesas with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. Talas rode with a fluid grace, his body a part of the animal's rhythm, his gaze sweeping the horizon. For 2 days he had been tracking the memory of a storm, a ghost of moisture that had passed to the north, hoping it had fed the small, seasonal river that was his family's lifeline. It was when he reached the river that he felt the first cold knot tighten in his gut. The water was lower than it should be, a thin silver ribbon clinging to the deepest part of the channel, the sun already drinking greedily from its surface. But it wasn't the water level that held his attention. It was the stake. Driven deep into the hard-packed earth near the bank was a shaft of raw, milled pine, its top painted a garish red. It was a thing of straight lines and sharp angles, an insult to the flowing, curved world around it. Talas dismounted, his moccasins making no sound on the dusty ground. He ran a hand over the wood. It was smooth, foreign, smelling of sawdust and a distant mill, not of the pinon and sage that scented the air. He followed the riverbank, his eyes scanning, and found another, and then a third, further down, each one a nail pounded into the heart of his land. He knew what they were. He had seen them before, years ago, following the men who laid the iron rails. They were markers, they were claims, they were the beginning of a story that always ended with his people losing something they could not live without. These stakes didn't follow the straight path of a railroad, though they hugged the curves of the river. They spoke not of tracks, but of channels, of canals. They were a promise to bend the river, to lead it away from this valley, away from the cornfields his grandmother tended, away from the life they had so carefully rebuilt. The long walk was a wound that never fully healed in his family. Shimasani Ada, his grandmother, spoke of it only in hushed tones, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She spoke of the forced marches, the sickness, the bitter cold of the Bosque Redondo reservation, the slow death of hope. They were the survivors who had returned, who had found this small, sheltered canyon where the memory of their ancestors clung to the rock walls. Here, they had built a new hogan, its earthen walls a comfort against the wind, its door facing the rising sun. Here, they were meant to be safe. Talas pulled the last stake from the ground. The wood felt profane in his hand. He stared at the hole it left, a dark, empty wound in the earth. He knew this was more than wood and paint. It was a declaration of war, a war to be fought not with arrows and guns, but with paper and laws he did not understand, and with the quiet, relentless theft of water. He rode back to the hogan as the sun began to dip, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and deep violet. The smell of wood smoke and roasting corn greeted him. His younger cousin, Dolly, a boy of 15 with bright, curious eyes and the lanky awkwardness of a colt, was practicing with his bow, sending arrows thumping into a bundle of dried grass. He grinned at Talas's approach. "Did you find where the storm fell?" Dolly asked, his voice cracking with the uncertainty of youth. Talas swung down from Sky Jumper, laying a hand on the boy's shoulder. It passed to the north. The river is low. He did not show Dolly the stake. There was no need to plant fear in the boy's heart yet. Inside the hogan, the air was warm and smelled of herbs. Shimasani Ada sat by the central fire, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her silver hair tied back in a traditional bun. Her hands, though gnarled with age, moved with purpose, grinding juniper leaves in a stone bowl. She was a healer, her knowledge of plants and prayers a shield for their small family. She looked up as Talas entered, her dark eyes missing nothing. "Your spirit is troubled, my grandson." Talas sat across the fire from her, the flames dancing between them. He told her of the painted stakes. He spoke in their native Dine, the words flowing softly, filled with the gravity of his discovery. She listened without interruption, her expression unchanging, but he saw the old pain flicker in the depths of her eyes. "The Bilagana," she said finally, the name for the white people a simple statement of fact, not an accusation. They are a people of straight lines. They think the world can be cut into pieces and owned. They do not understand that the river has its own path, that the land has a soul. She looked at him, her gaze sharp. "This is a fight for the soul of the land. Talas, you must be careful. Their thirst is a fire that consumes everything." Miles away, that same thirst was a matter of contracts and capital, a train of 3 sturdy wagons, pulled by sweat-darkened mules, rattled to a halt at the edge of the valley. The noise was an affront to the evening's calm, the creak of leather, the jangle of chains, the shouted curses of the teamsters. At the head of this caravan rode Clive Doolin. He was a man built of the same hard, unyielding material as the railroad spikes he sometimes drove. His face was burned a permanent, angry red, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a perpetual squint of suspicion. As foreman for the Arizona Water and Mining Consortium, he saw the land not in terms of souls, but in acres, not in terms of life, but in dollars. He was a man who used violence as a tool, as calmly and efficiently as a carpenter used a hammer. "Right here, boys," he bellowed, his voice scraping the quiet air. "Make camp. I want a fire going and the picket line set before full dark. This is Heartland now, or it will be soon enough." His men, a rough collection of hired guns and laborers, moved with a practiced, weary efficiency. They were not men who loved the land. They endured it for a wage. Standing slightly apart from the clamor was Evelyn Hart. At 22, she seemed a fragile thing in this harsh landscape, her fair skin already showing the first signs of a burn despite the wide brim of her hat. She was dressed not in a dress, but in a practical split skirt and a man's sturdy linen shirt, a compromise that still drew scornful looks from Doolin's crew. In her hands, she held not a rifle, but a tripod, and slung over her shoulder in a heavy leather case was her camera. She was here officially as a surveyor and photographer, tasked with mapping the proposed canal route and documenting the terrain for the investors back east. This was a lie, or at least only a sliver of the truth. Her true purpose was a secret she kept locked behind a carefully neutral expression. She was the daughter of Horace Hart, the primary investor in the consortium, and she had come because she suspected his partner, a man named Sterling, was using her father's money to bleed the land and its people dry through deceit and force. She was here to find the proof her father was too proud, or too willfully blind, to see for himself. Evelyn set up her transit, leveling the device with a practiced touch, and took a sight reading on the setting sun. The mathematics were a comfort, a world of clean lines and predictable outcomes. But when she lowered the instrument and looked at the valley through her own eyes, her carefully constructed composure wavered. The light was breathtaking. It turned the rock formations into temples of fire and gold. A hawk circled high overhead on a thermal, a perfect, soaring curve against the deepening blue of the sky. She felt a profound sense of trespass. as if she and this noisy, graceless crew were desecrating a sacred space. "Get your pictures." "Miss Hart," Doolin's voice cut through her thoughts. He had walked up behind her, his boots crunching on the delicate cryptobiotic soil. "Need to show the folks back in Philadelphia what their money's buying?" He grinned, a humorless stretching of his lips that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Prime land. Just needs water. We bring the water. We bring civilization." "There are people who already live here," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but firm. "They seem to have a civilization of their own." Doolin spat a stream of tobacco juice near her boot. "Savages living in mud huts. That's not civilization, that's infestation. We're doing them a favor." He gestured vaguely toward the canyon. "Once the canal is dug and the mines are open, this place will be worth a fortune. They can have what's left over." Evelyn felt a familiar sickness rise in her. This was the voice of Sterling, funneled through his hired thug. It was the voice of greed dressed in the clothes of progress. Her father spoke of progress too, but he spoke of dams and irrigation, of turning the desert green for farmers and families. He never spoke of infestations or what was left over, at least not to her. She turned her back on Doolin, focusing on her equipment. "I need to document the existing water sources along the proposed route. Mr. Doolin, all of them. That was my father's specific instruction." Doolin grunted, "You do your mapping. I'll handle the rest. Just don't get in my way." As the last of the light faded, the men's campfire blossomed into a cheerful, hungry blaze, its light flickering and dancing against the ancient rocks. Their laughter was loud and raw. They were an island of noise and iron in a vast ocean of silence and stone. From a high ledge a half-mile away, hidden in the deep shadows of a juniper stand, Talas Bege watched them. He had seen their wagons arrive, had watched them set up their camp on the flat ground near the river, the same ground where his own ancestors had once held their ceremonies. He couldn't make out individuals, only the dark shapes of men moving around a fire, their voices carrying faintly on the night air. He felt no heat from their fire, only a spreading coldness in his own chest. They were here. The straight lines had arrived. Shimasani Ada's words echoed in his mind. Their thirst is a fire that consumes everything. He watched the alien camp, a single, unknown woman within its circle, and knew that the dry, peaceful days were over. The fight for the river, for his family, for the soul of the land, had just begun. Part 2, The River Mist and the Silent Vow. Dawn in the high desert did not arrive. It seeped. It began as a faint dilution of the blackness in the east, a slow bleed of gray that silhouetted the mesas and softened the hard edges of the world. With the gray came the cold and a thick ghostly mist, born from the river's cool breath meeting the warmer night air. It clung to the valley floor, muffling sound and turning the familiar landscape into a place of secrets. For Evelyn Hart, the mist was a blessing. After days of travel, a fine layer of red dust coated everything she owned, including her own skin. It was in her hair, under her nails, a constant gritty reminder of her displacement, the thought of another day in the saddle. Directing the placement of survey stakes under the contemptuous gaze of Clive Doolin and his men was unbearable without first washing away the grime and the fatigue. While the camp snored around her, she slipped from her tent, a bar of lye soap and a linen towel clutched in her hand. She moved quietly, a shadow among shadows. Following the sound of the river, she found a secluded bend, shielded by a thicket of willows and a jumble of water-smoothed boulders. The mist was thickest here, a curtain of white that promised privacy. The world felt still, hers alone. She laid her towel and clean clothes on a flat, dry rock, then unbuttoned her travel-worn shirt. The cool air was a shock against her skin, raising goosebumps. For a moment, she hesitated, the vulnerability of her position acute, but the desire for the cleansing water was stronger. She slipped out of her remaining clothes and waded into the river. The water was bitingly cold. stealing her breath, but it felt pure. It washed away the dust, the sweat, the tension coiled in her shoulders. She submerged herself, letting the current tug gently at her hair, and felt, for the first time in days, a sense of peace. She was just a woman in a river, the mist her only witness. Talus had risen before the gray light, his routine as old as his people. He moved to the rope corral where Skyjumper waited, the mare nickering softly at his approach. He intended to take her to a quiet spot upstream from the camp of the Bilagana, where a small, clear spring fed into the river. The water there was sweeter, untouched. He led the horse by the halter, his steps silent on the damp earth. The mist swirled around his legs, deadening the sound of his approach. He was thinking of the painted stakes, of the weight of his grandmother's words. His mind a quiet turmoil of strategy and sorrow. He reached the willows that guarded the spring. His thoughts turned inward, expecting nothing but the familiar gurgle of water and the rustle of awakening birds. And then he saw her. Through a thinning patch in the mist, a form materialized in the shallow water. It was a silhouette at first, softened and made ethereal by the vapor. The pale curve of a shoulder, the line of a back, the dark spill of wet hair. It was the woman from the camp, the one with the strange tripod and the serious eyes. His heart seized in his chest, a powerful, painful jolt. It was an intrusion, a violation of her privacy, and his first instinct was shame. He stopped, frozen behind the screen of willows, his hand tightening on Skyjumper's rope. He knew he should leave, melt back into the mist as silently as he had come. But his feet were rooted to the ground. In that single, stolen moment, the world shifted on its axis. He saw not an enemy, not a Bilagana surveyor, but the raw, unguarded truth of a human being. The sight struck him with the force of a vision, a truth so clear and absolute it transcended thought. He saw her naked in the river mist. By mistake he knew she was his forever. The thought was not a choice, it was a revelation, as elemental and undeniable as the rising sun. It was a vow made not with his voice, but with the entire capacity of his soul. It was terrifying, it was sacred. Wrenching himself from his paralysis, he began to back away. Honor demanded it, respect demanded it. He turned, his movements clumsy in his haste, and his moccasin came down on a loose, round stone hidden in the damp soil. The rock skittered, dislodging others in a small, clattering cascade that sounded like a rifle shot in the pre-dawn stillness. Evelyn gasped, whirling around at the sound. Her eyes, wide with panic, met his. For a heartbeat, they were both suspended in a tableau of mutual shock. Then, mortification flooded her. She tried to cover herself, her hands flying to her chest as she scrambled backward toward the bank. In her panic, her foot slipped on a slick, moss-covered stone beneath the water. Her arms flailed, her balance gone. A small, frightened cry escaped her lips as she went down. Talus didn't think. He moved. 3 long strides and he was at the river's edge, plunging into the icy water after her. He reached for her just as her head went under, his strong hand closing around her arm. He pulled her up, sputtering and coughing, her wet hair plastered to her face. The terror in her eyes was wild. "It's okay," he said, the English words feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. He helped her to her feet, his arm steadying her as she stumbled toward the bank. He was acutely aware of her bare skin against his buckskin shirt, of the frantic beat of her heart against his hand. He guided her onto the grassy bank and then immediately released her, stepping back to give her space, his gaze fixed respectfully on the ground. Evelyn snatched her towel from the rock, wrapping it tightly around herself, her body trembling from cold and shock. The initial terror was already giving way to a hot, furious wave of shame and anger. "Who are you? What were you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking but laced with the sharp edge of command she used with the survey crew. Talus kept his eyes lowered. "My horse. Water," he said, his English sparse, pointing vaguely toward the spring. "I did not see. I am sorry." He looked up then, just for a second, and his eyes were not menacing or leering. They were filled with a profound, sincere regret. "I'm sorry," he repeated, the words carrying a weight that transcended language. Evelyn stared at him. This was one of the savages Doolin spoke of with such derision, yet he had not stared. He had apologized. He had pulled her from the river when she fell. The anger and humiliation were still there, a confusing storm inside her. But beneath them, a grudging sense of gratitude took root. She was alive, and not harmed. She clutched the towel tighter. "You should go," she said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. "Please, just go." He nodded once, a gesture of solemn understanding. Without another word, he turned, collected Skyjumper's rope, and led the mare away, disappearing back into the mist as silently as a spirit. Evelyn stood trembling for a long time, the cold of the morning air seeping into her bones. Her mind replayed the incident in a dizzying loop, the noise, the fall, the strength of the hand that had saved her, the quiet apology in a language not his own. He was nothing like the crude, loud men in her camp. He was nothing like the brutal caricature that lived in the town's prejudice. The realization was as unsettling as the encounter itself. Hidden in a dense patch of salt cedar 50 yards away, Jebediah Sloan had seen it all. Or rather, he had seen enough. Jeb was a weaselly man with shifty eyes and an eagerness to please his employer, Clive Doolin. He'd been sent to keep an eye on the Hart woman, whom Doolin trusted about as far as he could throw a dead horse. Jeb hadn't seen Talus's respectful turning away. He hadn't clearly seen Evelyn slip. What he had seen, through the swirling mist, was the Navajo warrior plunging into the river toward the naked white woman. He had seen them come out of the water together, his arm around her. He saw an intimate, shocking scene. He licked his thin lips, his mind already spinning the story, embellishing it, making it juicier and more damning. He didn't wait to see the end. He crept away from his hiding spot and scurried back toward the waking camp, carrying his poisonous story like a precious treasure. By the time the sun had burned the mist from the valley, the story was already spreading through the camp like a grass fire, whispered from man to man behind dirty hands. It grew with each telling. Jeb's simple observation became a lurid tale of a planned meeting, of impropriety in the wild. When Evelyn returned to camp, dressed and composed, but with a telltale tremor still in her hands, she could feel the change immediately. The men's eyes followed her, their usual rough greetings replaced by snickers and speculative glances. Doolin watched her from across the fire, a knowing, unpleasant smirk on his face. "Enjoy your morning bath, Miss Hart?" he asked, his voice dripping with insinuation. Evelyn's chin lifted. The morning was fine, Mr. Doolin. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She would not let them see how shaken she was. But a cold dread was beginning to settle in her stomach. She had made a foolish, careless mistake, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that in this harsh and unforgiving place, the consequences would be severe. Later that morning, after the wagons had moved on to the next survey point, Clive Doolin rode back to the river bend alone. He wasn't a surveyor, but he knew how to read a story left in the dirt. He dismounted, his eyes scanning the ground. He saw it all. The small, neat prints of a woman's bare feet leading into the water. The deeper, larger tracks of a man's moccasins. The churned-up mud on the bank where there had been a struggle, or a rescue. The evidence confirmed Jeb's story, at least the parts Doolin cared about. They had been here, together. He was about to turn away when a glint of white caught his eye, tucked near the base of the rock where she had left her things. He bent down and picked it up. It was a fine linen handkerchief, delicate and small, with the initial O's embroidered in blue thread in one corner. She must have dropped it in her haste. Doolin held the small square of cloth between his thumb and forefinger. It was a fragile, civilized thing, a lady's thing. In his hand, it became something else entirely. It was proof. It was a prop. It was the perfect, tangible piece of a story. He was already crafting a story that would discredit the surveyor, put the fear of God into the savages, and give him all the leverage he needed to claim this river without a fight. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it in his vest pocket. Part 3. The Straight Line of Steel. The Curve of the River. The days that followed the incident at the river were a lesson in isolation. Within her own camp, Evelyn Hart became a ghost. The men, once merely coarse, now treated her with a veiled contempt that was far more unnerving than open hostility. Their whispers followed her like the dry rasp of cicadas, and the story of her morning bath, twisted into something ugly and cheap by Jeb Sloan's telling, had become camp lore. Clive Doolin said nothing more about it, which was worse. He would simply watch her, a smug, proprietary look in his eye, as if he now owned her shame. She found refuge in her work, pouring all her focus into the brass and glass of her instruments. She pushed deeper into the valley, her survey lines a series of rigid, uncompromising strokes upon the ancient landscape. But the encounter with the Navajo man, Talas, she had learned his name was, whispered with a mix of fear and respect by a local freighter, had changed her perception. She began to see the land not as a blank canvas waiting for canals and railroads, but as a living text, full of stories she couldn't read. One afternoon, while mapping a series of dry feeder streams, she felt a familiar prickling on her neck, the sense of being watched. She looked up toward a high rock spire and saw him, a motionless silhouette on horseback against the vast, blue canvas of the sky. It was Talas. He did not wave or call out. He simply sat there for a long moment, then lifted his chin, a subtle gesture toward a section of the canyon wall she had planned to ignore, a place the survey maps marked as impassable. Then he was gone. Doubt warred with a strange, inexplicable trust. Doolin had forbidden her from straying from the primary route, but Doolin's authority felt like a cage, and the silent gesture from the man on the spire felt like a key, on a pretext of photographing unique geological formations. She guided her mule toward the area he had indicated. What she found stunned her. Tucked into a recess of the canyon, almost completely overgrown, was a series of low stone walls, expertly crafted without mortar. They formed a terraced system of check dams, designed to slow the flow of flash floods and allow the precious water to soak into the earth. Further in, carved into the sandstone under a protective overhang, were petroglyph spirals, clan symbols, and a repeating image of a flowing river, a testament to a deep and lasting connection to this place. This was not the work of nomads in mud huts. This was sophisticated, sustainable engineering, centuries old. She worked with a feverish intensity, her camera capturing the proof Doolin and the consortium insisted didn't exist. Each click of the shutter felt like an act of defiance. This was the evidence she needed not just of her father's partner's greed, but of a prior claim, a moral right to the water written in stone. The world of straight lines was encroaching from all sides. To the east, work crews were setting telegraph poles, their stark, cruciform shapes marching across the desert, promising instantaneous communication for a price. From the south came the rhythmic, percussive clang of steel on steel, the sound of the railroad advancing, bringing with it a new kind of time, measured in schedules and timetables, not seasons. The nearest town, dusty and ambitious, buzzed with talk of progress. Civilization was coming, they said, but civilization had a thirst. In the town's only saloon, Clive Doolin fanned the flames of resentment. He never raised his voice. He would buy a round of whiskeys for the local ranchers and miners, his voice a low, conspiratorial rumble. "Can't grow a town on dust," he'd say, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The consortium aims to fix that, bring in a proper canal. What about the Navajos up canyon, a grizzled prospector would ask. That river's all they got. Doolin would take a slow sip. Things change. Besides, he'd add, leaning in. I'm not sure we should be worrying about folks who have no decency. Got that surveyor girl? Hart's own daughter, running around with him. Found her down at the river, buck naked with that be-gay fella? Not a stitch on her. He'd shake his head in mock sadness. A woman like that, her word ain't worth much. And a people who would do that to a white woman, well, they ain't deserving of the water, are they? The poison worked, the story spread, and with it, the justification for theft. The narrative was simple and brutal: a sullied woman, a savage people, and a righteous thirst. Then, nature itself seemed to join the conflict. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown. The wind, which had been a constant, sighing presence, began to howl, picking up the topsoil and turning the air into a suffocating, blinding fog of dust. The storm lasted for 2 days. It was a physical assault, a scouring of the land that drove every living thing to shelter. Evelyn's canvas tent was nearly ripped from its moorings. The survey crew's animals huddled miserably, their eyes and nostrils caked with mud. When the wind finally died, it left a world transformed. The air was thick with a choking stillness, and a fine layer of dust covered everything, a shroud of brown over the vibrant red earth. Several of the ranchers on the outskirts of town found their cattle dead, their lungs filled with dust. The land was gasping, parched. The heat that followed was oppressive, a heavy, wet blanket that made breathing a chore, and with the heat came sickness. At the hogan, Dolly began to burn with a fever that would not break. He thrashed in his sleep, his skin hot and dry to the touch, his words a delirious jumble. Shimasani Ada worked tirelessly, brewing teas from willow bark and applying cool compresses, her soft chants filling the small space, but the fever held its ground. Talas watched, a helpless, cold fear gripping him tighter than he'd ever felt in battle. The boy was slipping away. Evelyn heard about the sick boy from a Navajo woman she'd given a small portion of her water to a few days prior. An impulse she couldn't explain. A mixture of guilt for her people's presence and a genuine human sympathy drove her to act, carrying her small medical kit, which contained little more than quinine, bandages, and carbolic acid. She walked to the hogan. Talas met her at the entrance, his face a mask of exhaustion and suspicion. "What do you want?" "I heard your cousin is sick," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I might be able to help." He blocked the way. "We have our own medicine." From within, Shimasani Ada's voice, though weary, was clear. "Let her enter, my grandson." Talas stepped aside, his distrust warring with his desperation. The air inside was thick with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. Evelyn's eyes adjusted to the dim light, seeing Dolly on a sheepskin pallet, his breathing shallow. Shimasani Ada looked up at her, her ancient eyes searching Evelyn's face, looking for something beyond her skin color, beyond the rumors. She saw the genuine fear and compassion there. "His spirit is fighting a fire inside," the old woman said in a mix of dying and halting English. For the next several hours, 2 worlds of medicine converged. Shimasani Ada prepared a small, domed structure of willow branches, a sweat lodge. She heated rocks in the central fire until they glowed. Meanwhile, Evelyn, seeing the boy's dehydration, used her own limited supply of purified water to bathe his forehead and coax tiny sips between his cracked lips. When the lodge was ready, Talas carried Dolly inside. Shimasani Ada poured a liquid of potent herbs over the hot stones, and the lodge filled with a hissing, aromatic steam. Evelyn, invited by a nod from the old woman, helped keep the cloths on Dolly's head cool, her presence a quiet support. She did not question the ceremony. She respected it. In the small, dark, intensely hot space, the barriers began to melt away. too," Shimasani Ada said, gesturing to the water. "Water? Hey," Talas murmured when Evelyn handed him a fresh cloth. "Thank you." Evelyn repeated the words softly, her pronunciation clumsy. Talas corrected her gently. A bridge of language, small but vital, was being built in the crucible of the fever. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Doli fell into a deep, natural sleep, his skin cool and damp with sweat. Shimasani Ada placed a wrinkled hand on Evelyn's arm, a gesture of profound gratitude that needed no words. Talas looked at Evelyn across the dying fire, and the suspicion in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, grudging respect. She was not the woman from the rumors. She was a woman who had helped save his family. A fragile peace had been forged, but it could not last. A few days later, her confidence bolstered. Evelyn went to the river to document the dropping water levels. As she approached the main crossing, she saw a group of Navajo women and children being turned away by two of Doolin's hired guns, including the weaselly Jeb Sloan. "Get on back to your canyon," Jeb sneered, shoving an elderly woman who stumbled and nearly fell. "This is company water now. No charity for your kind." A cold, clear rage, unlike anything she had ever felt, washed over Evelyn. This was it. This was the crime, happening in plain sight. She raised her camera, uncapped the lens, and slid a plate into place. The men were laughing, their backs to her. She steadied the heavy device on its tripod. The chemical flash erupted with a puff of white smoke and a sharp pop. The men whirled around, their faces a mixture of shock and fury, momentarily blinded. "It's the girl," one of them yelled. "Get that camera," Jeb screamed, his face contorted with rage. They charged toward her. Evelyn fumbled to secure the precious glass plate, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew they wouldn't just destroy the camera. They would harm her to silence her. She was alone, exposed. Suddenly, a blur of motion erupted from the cottonwoods. Talas! He moved not with the wildness of a brawler, but with a lethal, focused grace. He did not strike to kill, but to disable. A hard blow sent one man sprawling into the shallow water. He used Jeb's own momentum to throw him into the dusty bank. It was over in seconds. The picture, Evelyn cried, clutching the plate holder. Talas grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. The other men were already recovering, reaching for their sidearms. "There is no time, we have to run now." He pulled her along, away from the river, away from the camp, toward the jagged maze-like canyons that fringed the valley. The shouts and curses of Doolin's men followed them. They scrambled over rocks and through thorny brush, Talas seeming to know a path that wasn't there. As dusk bled into a moonless night, they finally found refuge in a deep, narrow slit in the rock. Completely hidden from view, they collapsed against the cold stone, panting for breath, the precious photograph clutched between them. They were alone, together, fugitives in the dark. Part 4, the father's name, the daughter's price. The canyon held them in a cradle of cold stone and profound silence. The stars, unobscured by smoke or lamps, were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds against black velvet. For hours, they didn't speak, the adrenaline of their flight slowly draining away, leaving behind a deep, aching weariness. Evelyn clutched the precious glass plate, wrapped carefully in her neckerchief, its sharp edges a grounding reality in the surreal darkness. Talas moved with a cat-like quietness, gathering dried brush for a small, smokeless fire in a deep recess of the rock. The flames, when they came, were a comfort, pushing back the immense, pressing dark. He looked at her hands, which were scraped and bleeding from their scramble through the brush. Without a word, he took a small pouch from his belt, crushed some dried leaves yarrow. She guessed from the scent and mixed them with a few drops of water from his canteen to make a paste. He gently applied the poultice to her cuts. His touch was firm, but surprisingly gentle, his focus absolute. "Your weapon," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be part of the canyon itself. He nodded toward the plate she held. "It is worth this risk." "It's the only weapon I have that they might understand," she replied, her voice hoarse. "In my world, a picture can be a kind of truth. It can't be easily argued with. It shows what happened. It proves the lie." He considered this, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. A captured shadow that tells the truth. He looked at her, and for the first time there was no barrier between them, no suspicion, no social divide. Only two people huddled by a fire, bound by a shared danger. "You are brave, braver than you should have to be." That fragile trust, born in a sweat lodge and forged in a desperate flight, carried them through the night. At dawn, they knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed food. And more importantly, they needed to know what Doolin's next move would be. The safest place to be invisible, they reasoned, was in a crowd. It was a market day in the nearby town of Redemption, a weekly flood of ranchers, prospectors, townsfolk, and natives that might allow them to gather information and supplies without being noticed. Redemption was a chaotic symphony of noise and smells. The dust of the main street was churned by horses, wagons, and 100 pairs of boots. The air was thick with the scent of livestock, fried bacon, and cheap whiskey. Evelyn pulled her hat low, trying to make herself as small as possible, while Talas moved through the throng with a quiet, watchful ease that was its own form of camouflage. They were near the assayer's office when Clive Doolin's voice cut through the din like a breaking bottle. He was standing on the bed of a freight wagon, a position that gave him a stage over the entire street. Jeb Sloan and 2 other of his hired guns stood below, making sure he had an audience. "Friends, neighbors," Doolin called out, his voice radiating a false sincerity. "I know you're all worried about the water, worried about your future. I'm here to tell you the Arizona Water Consortium shares your concerns." A murmur went through the crowd. Talas pulled Evelyn into the shadow of an awning, his hand resting instinctively on her arm. "We are here to bring progress," Doolin continued, his voice rising. "But there are forces working against us. Deception, lies. Some of you have seen this woman here." He pointed, and though he couldn't see them, his fingers seemed to aim directly at Evelyn. "This surveyor, this photographer, she presents herself as an independent worker, but I have here a letter from our offices in Philadelphia." He held up a piece of paper for all to see. "She is no simple surveyor. She is a spy in our midst. Her name is Evelyn Hart, and she is the daughter of our main investor, Mr. Horace Hart himself." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Every head turned, seeking her out. The whispers started, venomous and fast. "Hart's daughter playing us all for fools. She's a lure, sent to lull the Indians while her daddy steals the river." The world tilted under Evelyn's feet. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, the weight of their judgment a physical blow. She looked at Talas. The warmth and trust she had seen in his eyes by the firelight was gone, replaced by a look of stunned, profound betrayal. The shock was so deep it looked like pain. He dropped his hand from her arm as if it had been burned. He pulled her, roughly this time, into the narrow alley between the assayer's office and the livery stable. He pressed her against the rough wood of the wall, his hands on her shoulders, his face inches from hers. The quiet intensity was more frightening than any shout. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Is your father the one who sends these men? Is your name the one on the papers that will make my people thirst?" Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, tears of fear and frustration. The carefully constructed walls around her secret crumbled. "Yes," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "My father is Horace Hart. But it's not what you think. I didn't come here to help them. I came to stop them." She told him everything then, the words tumbling out in a desperate, frantic rush. She spoke of her father, a good man blinded by ambition and the smooth lies of his partner. Sterling. She told him of her suspicions, of her secret mission to gather proof of Sterling's corruption, proof of the violence and intimidation her father would never condone. "I was going to show him the pictures, the survey maps of your people's land," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I needed proof he couldn't deny. I was afraid to confront him without it. He's still my father." Tala searched her face, his expression a storm of conflicting emotions. He had seen her kindness to Dolly. He had seen her courage at the river. But the name Hart was the name of the enemy, the faceless power that had sent the stakes and the guns. To trust her now felt like the ultimate folly. Before he could respond, a shadow fell over them. "Miss Hart." Sheriff Hale stood at the mouth of the alley. He was a tall, weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much trouble. 2 deputies flanked him, their hands resting on their pistols. "There's been a complaint," the sheriff said, his tone apologetic but firm, inciting public indecency, associating with hostiles, corrupting the peace. A lot of folks are concerned. "Those are lies, Sheriff," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "Doolin is the one causing the trouble." "Maybe so," Hale conceded, with a troubled glance toward the celebrating crowd outside the saloon. "But right now, you're the one the trouble is about. For your own safety, I'm placing you under arrest." The deputies took her arms. Evelyn looked back at Talas, her eyes begging him to believe her. He stood as still as the stone of the canyon, his face unreadable, his heart a battlefield. He watched them lead her to the small, clapboard jailhouse and lock her inside. For a long time, Talas remained in the alley, the jeers and laughter from the saloon grating on his soul. He had been a fool. He had let a pretty face and a moment of kindness blind him to the truth. She was a Hart. She was one of them. He should turn his back, right away, and prepare his people for the fight to come. But then he remembered the fear in her eyes when she told him her story. He remembered the sincerity in her voice. He remembered her hands, covered in his cousin's sweat, working alongside his grandmother's. He saw Doolin swaggering out of the saloon, a look of triumph on his face. And in that moment, Talas knew that abandoning Evelyn to Doolin's mercy was the same as surrendering the river. The fight for the one was the fight for the other. His choice was made. He did not go to his own people for help. This was a fight that needed different weapons. He found Mateo, a young Mexican vaquero whose family had lost their grazing land to a mining outfit, honing a knife by the livery. He found Silas, the town's blacksmith, a barrel-chested man with a quiet hatred for the arrogant swagger of company men who treated him like a servant. He spoke to them in a mix of Spanish, English, and gestures, his voice low and urgent. He spoke of Doolin's lies and of a common enemy. He did not ask them to fight for a Navajo cause, but for a chance to strike back at the forces that were choking them all. They listened, and in their eyes, he saw a shared spark of rebellion. They agreed. The plan was simple and chaotic. As dusk fell, Mateo and his cousins let out a series of piercing yells and drove a half-dozen half-wild ponies down the main street, scattering tables and sending people diving for cover. As Sheriff Hale and his deputies raced toward the commotion, Silas moved to the back of the jail. With 2 powerful, muffled blows from a heavy sledgehammer, he shattered the cheap iron lock on the cell's single barred window. Talas was there, pulling a stunned Evelyn through the opening. "There is no justice for us in this town," he said, his voice grim. "We have to make our own." He led her not to the canyons, but to the one place Doolin would not expect, the new telegraph office at the edge of town. The young operator, intimidated by Talas's presence and a silver dollar from Evelyn, tapped out her coded message to a lawyer in Santa Fe, a man who owed her father a favor but despised corporate greed. Proof of water theft and violent intimidation by AZWM. Doolin. Evidence follows. Need federal injunction. Imperative. She then packaged the precious glass plate in a padded box, along with a desperate, detailed letter. She found an express rider about to depart and paid him every last dollar she had. To the offices of the Santa Fe New Mexican, she instructed him, find the reporter named Elias Thorne. Tell him this is the story of the decade. As they slipped out the back of the office into the gathering dark, a roar of pure fury erupted from the center of town. Doolin, standing on the porch of the saloon, had discovered the jailbreak. His voice carried across the entire town, a raw proclamation of violence. She's gone, run back to her savage lover. If they want to hide in that canyon, then we'll give them a fire to keep them warm. We'll burn every last Hogan to the ground tomorrow night. We are going to cleanse that riverbank for good. The threat hung in the cold night air, a promise of utter destruction. Tallis and Evelyn stood frozen in the shadows, the weight of his vow settling upon them. They had sent a message on a wire and a prayer on a horse. Now, all they had left was one night to stop a firestorm. Part 5. Ho-Ho amidst the gunfire. The night air was cold, but the heat of Clive Doolin's words seemed to have scorched the very stars. His threat to burn the Hogans echoed in the silence between Tallis and Evelyn as they found a defensible hiding place high in the labyrinth of rocks, a shallow cave overlooking the valley. The fire they built was small, a flickering island of light in an ocean of encroaching darkness. They sat on opposite sides of the flames, the chasm between them no longer one of culture or suspicion, but of shared, terrifying knowledge. The time for secrets was over, burned away by the threat of Doolin's torches. My grandmother says that after the long walk, our people were broken. Tallis began, his voice low, the words meant for her alone. Not just our bodies, but our spirits. We were taken from our land, the place where the holy people gave us life. They promised us safety, food, a new home. Every promise was a lie. Every piece of paper they made us sign was a cage. That is a wound we carry in our blood, that distrust. When I learned your name was Hart, it felt like the oldest lie had been given a new face. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching with a pain that was not her own, yet one she felt responsible for. I cannot understand that pain. Tallis, to pretend I could would be an insult. My life has been one of privilege, a word that means I have never been hungry, never been driven from my home, never had to fear the law instead of trusting it. It feels like a sickness, a guilt I can't wash off. I came here to expose a crime, to do one small, right thing. But my name, the name I carry, is the very symbol of the crime you have endured for generations. He looked across the fire at her, and the hardness in his eyes softened. He saw not the daughter of his enemy, but a woman wrestling with her own conscience, a woman who had risked everything for a truth she wasn't even sure she could uncover. My grandmother also teaches of Ho-Ho. He said, the Dani word sounding like a prayer. It means balance, harmony, beauty. It is not about living without conflict. It is about walking in a way that restores balance when it is lost. You and I, we are not in balance. Our worlds are at war, but we cannot fight this war from opposite sides of the canyon. He held his hand out over the small fire. We must choose to stand on the same ground. Evelyn reached across the flickering flames and took his hand. His skin was calloused and warm. Her own was trembling. I choose this ground, she said, her voice clear and strong. With you. The pact was sealed, a quiet treaty signed in the heart of the wilderness. They knew they couldn't fight alone. Before dawn, they slipped back toward the outskirts of Redemption, not to the town proper, but to the small house behind the church where Sheriff Hale lived. They found him on his porch, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at the sunrise with the eyes of a man who hadn't slept. He wasn't surprised to see them. Knew you wouldn't have run far, he sighed, gesturing for them to sit. Doolin's lost his mind. His threat to burn out the Hogans. That's not company business. That's inciting a riot. That's a lynching party waiting to happen. He's hired men from 3 counties over. Hard cases. He's operating outside of any law I represent. Then stop him, Evelyn urged. The sheriff shook his head, a gesture of weary frustration. With my 2 deputies against 30 hired guns, it would be a bloodbath, and I'd be the first one in the ground. No, we can't beat him with force. We have to beat him with the law, but a better law than mine." His words gave Evelyn an idea. There are others in this town who believe in that kind of law. Guided by Hale's reluctant advice, they found their unlikely allies. The first was Doc Abram, a Civil War surgeon with a limp and a healthy disdain for corporate bullies. He reviewed Evelyn's survey journal and the detailed notes accompanying her photographs. "This is meticulous work. Young lady," he declared, his voice raspy. "Professional. It proves a long-standing system of irrigation and land use. This ain't empty land. It's a community. Doolin's claim is fraudulent on its face. He agreed to sign a sworn affidavit attesting to the evidence's credibility." Their second ally was the town's moral compass, the elderly Reverend Miller. He was a man of quiet faith who had spent years ministering to all the people of the valley, Navajo and white alike. Evelyn showed him the photograph she had taken at the river, the one of Jeb Sloan and his man shoving the old woman. The Reverend stared at the captured shadow, his gentle face hardening into lines of righteous anger. "This," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "is an abomination. To deny water to the thirsty is to deny God himself. This is not progress. This is a profound sin." He too agreed to lend his name and his word, to stand as a moral witness against the consortium's actions. An alliance was being forged of law, science, and faith as they made their way back to the safety of the canyons. The sky, which had been a clear, placid blue, began to bruise with dark clouds. The air grew heavy and still. A sudden violent thunderstorm, unseasonable and savage, erupted over the high mesas. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. They were traversing a narrow slot canyon when they heard a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar. A flash flood, a wall of brown, churning water filled with debris was coming down the canyon toward them. "Up!" Talus yelled, grabbing her hand. "Climb!" There was no time to find a proper way out. He shoved her toward a narrow ledge about 10 feet up the canyon wall, a sliver of rock barely wide enough for a foothold. She scrambled up, her fingers finding purchase in the rough sandstone. Just as the torrent hit, Talus, caught by the leading edge of the flood, was nearly swept away. But he dug his heels in, fighting the current. The water rose with terrifying speed, a cold, thick sludge that pulled and tore at him. It was too high for him to climb. "I'm stuck," he yelled over the roar of the water. Evelyn, clinging to her perch, looked down in terror. She couldn't pull him up, but below her ledge, the canyon wall curved inward, creating a small, sheltered alcove just above the main force of the current. "There," she screamed, pointing. "Can you get there?" He fought his way through the hip-deep, debris-filled water, each step a monumental effort. He reached the alcove and hauled himself out of the main channel, collapsing into the small space, soaked and breathing hard. They were trapped, separated by 10 feet of vertical, slick rock and a raging flood. For hours they waited, the water slowly receding, leaving behind a thick layer of cold, stinking mud. When it was finally low enough to pass, Talus was shivering, his body temperature dropping dangerously. He helped Evelyn down, and they stumbled through the mud-choked canyon, searching for shelter. They found a shallow cave, little more than an overhang, but it was out of the wind. They were both soaked to the bone, their teeth chattering uncontrollably. "We need to get warm," Talus said, his voice slurred with cold. "Now!" There was no dry wood for a fire. There was only one source of heat left: their own bodies. They shed their wet outer layers, huddling together under his woolen poncho. The cold was a vicious, biting thing, but where their bodies touched, a desperate, vital warmth began to grow. Evelyn could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart against her cheek. He could feel the fine tremor of her shivering body. In that small, dark space, stripped of everything but the elemental need for survival, the last of their defenses fell. She looked up at him, her face pale in the gloom, her eyes wide and luminous. He looked down at her, and in her gaze he saw not fear, but an absolute trust. He saw the woman who had faced down his distrust, who had saved his cousin, who had made a pact with him by a fugitive's fire. The vow he had made to himself at the river that first morning returned to him. No longer a shocking revelation, but a simple, grounding truth. He lowered his head, and she met him halfway. Their kiss was not a thing of gentle romance. It was desperate, fueled by the cold, the fear, and the profound relief of being alive. It was a kiss of shared warmth, of acknowledged longing, a promise of life in the face of the encroaching darkness. They held each other tightly, two disparate souls clinging together, becoming a single bastion against the storm. When they finally made it back to the hogan, caked in mud and exhausted to the bone, Shimasani Ada was waiting. She looked from one to the other, her wise eyes seeing the change in them, the new and unbreakable bond that had been forged in the flood. She said nothing, but went into the hogan and returned with a magnificent woven blanket. The pattern was intricate, a design of interlocking diamonds in red, black, and white, and she held it out to Evelyn. "This is for you," she said, her English slow and deliberate. She pointed to a pattern of geometric shapes on one side. "This is the symbol of the Bitterwater clan, my grandson's people." Then she pointed to a different, flowing pattern on the other side, "And this is your path, the river you follow. 2 patterns, 2 paths." She folded the blanket so the 2 designs met and merged. 1 blanket. Evelyn took the gift, her hands trembling. It was more than a blanket. It was a blessing. It was an acceptance. It was a recognition of a union deeper than any law and redemption could understand. The fragile peace of the moment was shattered by the sound of a galloping horse. Mateo, the vaquero, slid his mount to a halt before the hogan, his face grim. He had ridden to the next town over, the one with the telegraph connection that Doolin didn't control. He held out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a reply from the lawyer in Santa Fe. Federal injunction requested. Judge requires sworn testimony. Reporter Elias Thorne en route. Hold on, they will arrive in 2 days. 2 days. Hope surged through Evelyn, bright and hot. Then Mateo delivered the final news. "I heard Doolin in the saloon. Senorita," he said, his eyes dark with worry. "He has liquor for all his men. Torches are soaked in kerosene. He is promising them land rights and a bonus for every person they run off. They ride tomorrow at sundown." The message hung in the air. A death sentence. The law was coming. Hope was coming. But it was coming one day too late. They had to survive the fire first. Part 6. The Night of Torches. The Day of Ash. The sun set on a world holding its breath. In the canyon, there were no war cries, no ceremonial preparations for a battle they knew they could not win. There was only a grim, quiet determination to endure. The old men and the young boys, armed with old hunting rifles and bows, melted into the shadows of the rocks they knew as well as their own hands. Their task was not to defeat Doolin's mob, but to delay it, to protect the women and children who were being hidden in the deepest, most inaccessible caves high up the canyon walls. Evelyn worked alongside Talis, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was no warrior, but her mind, trained in angles and stress points, saw the battlefield in a different way. She saw the narrow entrance to the canyon, the unstable scree slopes, the load-bearing rock formations. These were the land's defenses, if only they knew how to use them. As the last light died, they appeared, a ragged line of horsemen at the mouth of the valley, their forms silhouetted against the twilight sky. Then, one by one, the torches were lit. They bloomed in the darkness like malevolent flowers, a creeping line of fire that began to move toward the hogans. The sound rolled across the valley, first drunken laughter, taunts, and the chilling, wolf-like howls of men who had given themselves over to the beast within. Some carried ropes with pre-tied nooses, a clear and brutal statement of their intent. They were 100 yards from the first hogan when a lone rider galloped out to meet them. A hand raised for parley. It was Sheriff Hale. "Doolin, in the name of the law of this territory, I order you and your men to disperse." Hale's voice was steady, but it was a single, sane note in a symphony of madness. Clive Doolin rode to the front of his mob, his face illuminated by the flickering torchlight, twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "Your law doesn't reach here tonight." "Hale," he snarled. "This is company business. We're clearing squatters off our land. This is not a land dispute. It's an armed mob, and you know it," Hale countered, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Turn back now, or I'll be forced to—" He never finished the sentence. Doolin laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He raised his own pistol, aimed it at the sky, and fired. The shot ripped through the tense silence, a signal that all negotiation was over. It was immediately followed by a volley of shots from his men, and the night exploded into chaos. The Navajo defenders, hidden and disciplined, did not return a wildfire. They picked their targets. A horse screamed and went down. A rider clutched his shoulder and tumbled from his saddle. The initial charge of the mob faltered, breaking into confused, angry knots of men who began to set fire to the dry brush, determined to burn their enemy out. In the terrifying confusion, Shimasani Ada was not in a cave. She was on the ground, shepherding a small group of children who had been separated from their mothers toward a narrow fissure in the rock. She moved with a calm urgency, her voice a soothing murmur against their terrified whimpers. She had just pushed the last child into the safety of the crevice when a stray bullet, fired blindly into the shadows, struck her in the side. She fell with a soft grunt. Not a cry. Talas, who had been directing the defense from a nearby outcrop, saw her go down. A roar of pure, animalistic rage tore from his throat. He was at her side in an instant, trying to lift her. "Go!" she gasped, her hand clutching his arm, her eyes already clouded with pain. "Do not worry for me. The children are safe." She looked past him, toward the river, a silver ribbon in the moonlight. "Do not let them take the river. Talas, to keep the water is to keep the people. It is our soul." Her voice trailed off as a spasm of pain seized her. Seeing his grandmother fall, seeing the flames begin to lick at the roof of a nearby hogan, something shifted in Talas. This was no longer a defense. This was a reckoning. He saw Clive Doolin on the far side of the clearing, directing his men, his face lit with savage glee. Talas met his eyes across the chaos, and a silent challenge was issued and accepted. Talas began to move, a phantom in the smoke, circling to meet his true enemy. At the same moment, Evelyn's mind, sharpened by adrenaline, saw the path to salvation. It was not in bullets, but in stone. She grabbed the arm of a young Navajo man. "The survey explosives," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "The consortium supply wagon. I know where they keep the blasting charges. I need them." She didn't wait for an answer, sprinting toward the place she had last seen the supply wagon, a place Doolin and his men had left unguarded in their bloodlust. With the help of the young man, they dragged a heavy crate of dynamite sticks and a coil of fuse back into the shadows. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her hands were steady. She was no longer a photographer or a spy. She was a surveyor, and this was the most important survey of her life. She knew the geology of the canyon entrance, the lines of fracture in the rock face. She could bring it down, not to harm the river, but to seal the valley, to choke the fire. While Evelyn worked with frantic precision, cutting fuses and placing charges in the crevices of the rock, Talas confronted Doolin. He had drawn him away from the main fight, up a steep, narrow game trail that led to a high bluff overlooking the river. Below them, the battle raged, a hellish scene of smoke and orange light. "It ends here! Big A!" Doolin snarled, discarding his rifle in favor of a long-bladed knife. He still held his torch. "When I'm done with you, I'll burn your whole family from memory." They circled each other on the narrow ledge. It was not a fight of skill, but of raw hatred. Doolin lunged, and Talas parried. The knife a blur in his hand. They were locked together, muscle straining against muscle, their grunts and curses lost in the greater noise of the battle below. Evelyn was ready. She lit the main fuse, the sputtering spark racing away from her like a fiery serpent into the darkness. "Get back!" she screamed to the Navajo defenders. "Everyone, get back from the entrance!" She took cover behind a massive boulder just as the world turned into a concussive roar of sound and light. The explosion was immense, a titanic force that tore a huge section of the canyon wall loose. Tons of rock and earth cascaded downwards, a man-made avalanche. It fell with the sound of a giant sigh, a river of stone that completely blocked the canyon entrance. The rock slide smothered the brush fires near the entrance and created an impassable, 30-foot-high barrier of rubble. High on the bluff, the shockwave of the blast threw both Talas and Doolin to the ground. The torch flew from Doolin's hand, landing in a patch of dry, resinous pine needles at the edge of the cliff. The needles erupted in a sheet of flame. Doolin, disoriented, scrambled to his feet and stumbled backward, directly into the fire he had inadvertently created. His sleeve caught fire. He shrieked, a sound of pure panic, beating at the flames. He took another panicked step backward, his eyes wild with terror, his foot finding no purchase on the crumbling edge of the bluff. With a final, choked cry, he fell. He did not fall into the river, but tumbled down the steep slope, landing in a broken heap on the fresh, sharp-edged rubble of the rock slide below. The explosion and the fall of their leader broke the mob. The sudden, terrifying display of power, so far beyond anything they had expected, shattered their drunken courage. At that exact moment, as if in response to the violence, the bruised sky opened up. The first drops of the early seasonal rain began to fall cold, heavy, and cleansing. It hissed on the embers of the fires and slicked the rocks. The remaining gunmen, their faces pale in the dying torchlight, turned and fled into the night. The battle was over. The silence that descended was more shocking than the noise had been. It was a silence filled with the smell of rain on hot dust, the scent of cordite, and the quiet weeping of a child. Talas made his way down from the bluff, his face grim, his body bruised. Evelyn met him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes asking the question he couldn't bear to answer. Together, they went to where Shimasani Ada lay. A small group had gathered around her. Doli was holding her hand, his young face streaked with tears. They had laid her on a blanket, the blanket she had given Evelyn. Her breathing was shallow, a faint whisper of life. She opened her eyes as Talas and Evelyn knelt beside her. Her gaze was clear, the pain gone. She reached out a trembling hand, and Talas placed his own over it. Evelyn covered both of their hands with hers. "The balance is returning," Shimasani Ada whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She looked from her grandson's face to Evelyn's, seeing the future in their joined hands. Ho is not an easy path. You found it in the storm. Her eyes closed for a moment. Keep the balance. Keep the water. Her gaze rested on them. A final, binding blessing. Keep each other. Her hand went limp. The last breath sighed from her lips. She was gone. As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched over the canyon rim, the rain softened to a gentle mist. The day was coming, but it brought with it a heartbreaking stillness. They had won. They had saved the river. But the victory felt like ashes in their mouths. The matriarch, the healer, the heart of their family, had paid the price for the peace. Part 7, White Paper, Clear Water. The morning after the attack was one of gray ash and gray skies. The rain had cleansed the air, but it could not wash away the scent of burnt timber or the profound, Hollow silence left by Shimasani Ada's passing. Her body lay in honor within the hogan, wrapped in her finest blankets, her presence still a palpable force in the quiet grief of her family. By midday, the law arrived. It came not with the swagger of Doolin's mob, but with the sober gravity of federal authority. A circuit judge, a stern, whiskered man named Elias Thorne, rode in, accompanied by a federal prosecutor and 2 marshals. With them was the reporter from Santa Fe, a young, keen-eyed man who took in the scene the bullet-scarred rocks, the massive rock slide, the burned-out shell of a hogan with a furious scribbling in his notebook. They found Clive Doolin where he had fallen, alive but broken, his leg bent at an unnatural angle and his arm badly burned. He spat curses as they loaded him onto a wagon. Sheriff Hale, his face grim, handed over the half-dozen other men he had managed to round up, their drunken bravado having evaporated with the dawn. A makeshift court was convened in the open air, under the shadow of the canyon wall. Judge Thorne, using a wagon tailgate as his bench, was a man who wasted no time. The prosecutor, armed with the telegraphs and Elias Thorne's initial report, laid out the case. He called Sheriff Hale, who testified to Doolin's open threats and illegal assembly. He called Doc Abram, who presented his sworn affidavit about Evelyn's survey journal, explaining in clear scientific terms how it proved a sophisticated, long-term habitation of the land that predated any consortium claim. He called Reverend Miller, who spoke with quiet, unshakable moral authority about the consortium's campaign of intimidation and the sin of their actions, holding up Evelyn's photograph of the women at the river as his primary evidence. The glass plate, showing the brutishness of Jeb Sloan and the dignity of the Navajo woman, was passed among the officials, its silent testimony more powerful than any shouted accusation. Finally, the prosecutor called Evelyn Hart. She stood before the judge, not as an accused woman, but as the key witness. Her voice, though quiet, did not waver. She presented her journal, explaining the check dams, the petroglyphs, the evidence of a people deeply connected to the water. She recounted Doolin's threats, his campaign of lies, and the final, violent assault. She spoke with the cool precision of a scientist and the unshakable conviction of an eyewitness. As she finished her testimony, a new party of riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, where a path had been cleared through the rock slide. At their head was a man in a fine eastern suit, his face pale with dust and disbelief. He dismounted, his movements stiff, his eyes taking in the scene with a dawning horror. It was Horace Hart. He saw the broken bodies and burned buildings. He saw the cold fury on the faces of the federal marshals. And he saw his own daughter, standing not as a child in need of rescue, but as a pillar of strength and truth, her hand resting on the shoulder of the Navajo warrior who stood steadfastly beside her. The world of tidy contracts, shareholder reports, and polite lies he inhabited had collided with this brutal, undeniable reality. Judge Thorne's verdict was swift and absolute. He issued a binding federal injunction, recognizing the Navajo community's historical water rights and placing the river under federal protection until a permanent treaty could be established. He authorized the prosecution of the Arizona Water and Mining Consortium's partners, including Sterling, back in Philadelphia, on charges of conspiracy, incitement to riot, and attempted murder. The age of paper-thin claims enforced by gunfire was, for this valley, over. After the court was adjourned, Horace Hart approached his daughter. The crowd parted, leaving them in a circle of tense silence. "Evelyn," he began, his voice strained. "I came as soon as I received the lawyer's telegraph. I had no idea." "Didn't you?" Evelyn's voice was cold, not with hatred, but with a deep, weary disappointment. "Or did you simply choose not to look? You saw the profit margins." "Father, you saw the reports from Sterling. Did you never once ask about the cost?" He flinched as if struck. For the first time, he truly saw her. He saw the scrapes on her hands, the soot on her cheek, the profound sorrow and unyielding strength in her eyes. This was not the girl he had sent west to indulge a hobby. This was a woman forged in a crucible he had helped to build. The things Sterling told me, he faltered. He said the land was empty. He said we were bringing life to the desert. The lies he told, the lies I allowed myself to believe. His voice broke. What your mother's inheritance has been used for. It's a disgrace, a stain. The reconciliation was not a flood of forgiveness, but a slow, difficult turning of a tide. He was a man of an old world, a world built on the belief that progress was a straight, iron line. He could not unlearn that in a day, but he could, for the first time, see the curve of the river. I will make this right, he said, his voice gaining a measure of its old authority, but tempered now with humility. I am pulling all my capital. Sterling and the consortium are finished, but that is not enough. He looked at Talis, then at the other Navajo families who were watching, their faces stoic. Restitution must be made, not with money that can be spent and forgotten, but with something that will last, something that will serve the balance. He outlined his proposal he would fund. From his own pocket, the construction of the most advanced wind-powered well and pump station technology could provide, to be built on communal ground and managed by a council of the valley's residents, ensuring a stable water supply for generations. It was an offer of steel and gears, but it was also an apology. In the days that followed, as the dead were mourned and the slow work of rebuilding began, Talis and Evelyn made a decision. Their bond had been sealed by fire and flood, but they needed to honor it in the traditions of both their worlds, as a shield against any future legal challenges. The first ceremony was held inside the Hogan, which now felt both emptier and more sacred without Shimasani Ada's physical presence. It was a simple, quiet rite. Talis's family gathered, and Doli, his face solemn, stood as his witness. An elder uncle officiated, speaking in the soft, flowing cadences of Dain. He spoke not of contracts, but of the joining of clans, of the weaving of two lives into a single, strong blanket. He blessed them with corn pollen, a symbol of life and fertility, touching it to their foreheads, their mouths, and their hearts. Evelyn, wearing the blanket Shimasani Ada had given her, felt a profound sense of coming home, of being woven into the fabric of this family, this land. The second ceremony was a stark contrast. Judge Thorne, before departing, agreed to perform the legal rite. They stood outside the sheriff's office in Redemption, with Sheriff Hale and a bemused Elias Thorne as their witnesses. The judge read the formal, dry language from his book of territorial statutes. It spoke of rights and responsibilities, of property and heirs. It was a transaction of paper and ink, a world away from the spiritual union of the Hogan. But as they both said I do and signed their names in the ledger Talas Bigay, Evelyn Hart Bigay, they were building a bridge, a legal structure strong enough to withstand the assaults of the world outside their canyon. That evening, as the new peace settled over the valley, they walked to the river. The recent rains had turned it from a meager trickle into a healthy, vibrant flow. The water ran clear over the stones, its voice a happy, gurgling song. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deep purple sky. They came to the secluded bend, the place of their first chaotic meeting. The mist was beginning to rise from the water's surface, a soft, white breath in the cool air. It was no longer a curtain that hid secrets, but a gentle shroud that promised peace. Without speaking, they knelt at the water's edge, together. They reached down and placed their joined hands into the cold, clear current. The water flowed over their fingers, a living, cleansing force. It was the same water, the same place, but everything had changed. The vow Talis had made in secret that first morning, he now made again, with her hand in his, the future they had chosen. A future that once seemed impossible, now felt as real and as powerful as the river itself. The water, the source of all the conflict, had become the witness to their eternal promise. Part 10. The Water Keepers. Autumn arrived in the valley not with a fiery burst of color. for there were few deciduous trees to mark its passage. But with a change in the quality of the light, the sun, lower in the sky, cast longer shadows, and the air held a crisp, clean edge that spoke of the coming cold. It had been 4 months since the night of the torches. 4 months since the land had been scarred by fire and sanctified by rain. The most visible sign of the new era stood on a small rise overlooking the communal cornfields. It was a windmill, its steel blades turning with a steady, rhythmic whir in the constant breeze. A gift from Horace Hart. It was a machine of the new world, but its purpose was as old as the land itself. It drew clean, cool water from deep within the earth, feeding it into a stone-lined cistern from which anyone, Navajo, Mexican, or white, could draw. The windmill was the valley's new heart, its steady beat a promise of life, a testament to a peace that had been bought at a terrible price. The management of the water was overseen by a council, an idea born from the alliance that had saved them. Talas sat as the representative for his people. Mateo, the vaquero, spoke for the Mexican families. Sheriff Hale, now a man who seemed to have aged a decade and gained 2 of wisdom, represented the town. Even Silas the blacksmith had a seat. They met weekly, their discussions sometimes contentious, but always rooted in a shared understanding the water belonged to the land, and the land belonged to everyone who respected it. Below the windmill, in a long, low adobe structure built by many hands, was another symbol of the burgeoning peace, a school. Reverend Miller, his old eyes bright with purpose, taught reading and writing in English in the mornings. In the afternoons, one of the Navajo elders taught the children the stories and the language of the Dina. Doli, no longer a boy but a young man with a quiet confidence, was one of the first students, his hand, once clumsy with a bow, now proving deft with a pencil as he drew the symbols of both his own language and the new one. He was the future, a bridge between 2 worlds, learning to walk in balance. Evelyn's camera, once a weapon of truth, had found a new, more peaceful purpose. Her subjects were no longer injustices, but celebrations. She captured the quiet dignity of an old woman weaving at her loom, the unrestrained joy of children splashing in the overflow from the cistern, the intricate patterns of harvested blue corn laid out to dry. Her photographs were not for newspapers or courtrooms anymore. They were for the people of the valley, a record of their survival, their resilience, and their beauty. She was no longer an outsider documenting a foreign world. She was the community's memory keeper, her lens preserving the small, precious moments that constituted a life of Hozo. She often found Talas watching her, a quiet pride in his eyes. Their love had not been a whirlwind of grand passions, but a slow, deep rooting, like a juniper in rock. It was a love built of shared hardship, mutual respect, and the quiet comfort of knowing they stood on the same ground. He taught her the names of the stars in Dine. She read to him from books of poetry her father sent from the East. Their Hogan was a place of 2 languages, 2 histories, and 1 shared heart. One cool afternoon, they walked together to the riverbank, to the spot shaded by willows where Shimasani Ada had been laid to rest. In place of a cold stone marker, Talas had carved her name and clan symbols into a smooth, weathered piece of cottonwood. The simple monument was already becoming part of the landscape, a silent testament to the woman whose spirit still seemed to guide them. Talas knelt, touching the carved wood. She would be happy to see the windmill turning, he said, his voice soft. She believed in using new tools, as long as they served the old ways. The balance. She would be proud of you, Talas, Evelyn said, placing her hand on his shoulder. You are a leader. You've helped bring the people together. He shook his head. We did it together. I know how to listen to the land. You know how to speak the language of paper and law. One without the other would have failed. He looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with a love that needed no words. Shimasani Ada said you were the other half of the path. She saw it long before I did. He stood, and they looked out at the river. The water was clear and full, the lifeblood of the valley, flowing peacefully. The struggles were not over. Prejudice still existed in the hearts of some in redemption. The consortium, though broken, was a symptom of a greater hunger that still existed in the world beyond their canyon. The peace was not a gift. It was a garden they would have to tend every day, weeding out the hatred and watering the seeds of understanding. But it was their garden. They were the keepers of the water now, the keepers of the balance. The final image of their new life came, as the first had, at dawn. The air was cold, and a light, silvery mist hovered over the river, a final, gentle echo of the thick fog that had once hidden them from each other. Talus led Skyjumper from the corral, the mare's breath pluming in the chill. He was not a warrior going out on patrol, but a husband and a keeper of the land, ready for the day's work. At the river's edge, Evelyn knelt, scooping a bucket of clear, cold water. The rising sun caught the droplets, turning them into scattered jewels. She looked up and saw Talus watching her, his silhouette framed against the soft colors of the dawn. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of deep, quiet contentment. He returned it, his own smile reflecting the same profound peace in that shared glance. The memory of their first meeting was transformed. The shock, the fear, the shame, all of it had been washed away, leaving only the beautiful, undeniable truth. What had begun in the river mist as an accident had been forged by fire and flood, by choice and by love, into a promise. It was no longer a chance encounter, but a destiny they had chosen, and would continue to choose, every day, forever. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more people, please consider supporting it by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world